Imagine a country where 1/3 of the land lies below sea level. A country where millions of people live beneath the ocean, where one of Europe's busiest airports sits at the bottom of a former lake, where the lowest point is nearly 7 meters below sea level. By every law of nature, this place should not exist. If all the pumps stopped tomorrow, water would begin reclaiming the land within days. Fields would flood, roads would disappear, entire cities would slowly sink beneath the sea. And yet nearly 18 million people live here. They build homes, they grow food, they run one of the most advanced economies on Earth. This country should be underwater, but it isn't. This is the Netherlands, a nation that has spent more than 1,000 years fighting a war against water, and somehow winning. Today we're going to discover how the Dutch literally built their country with their own hands. We'll uncover the engineering systems that keep millions of people dry every day. We'll revisit the night the sea broke through and killed thousands. We'll expose one of the world's most famous myths, and we'll discover why the Dutch have recently started doing something nobody expected, giving land back to the water. To understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning, long before modern cities, long before giant pumps, long before massive flood barriers, back to a time when this land barely existed. The name Netherlands literally means low countries. And that's exactly what they are. The Netherlands sits inside one of the largest river deltas in Europe. Several major rivers, including the Rhine, flow into the North Sea here. For thousands of years, these rivers carried enormous amounts of sand, clay, and sediment, slowly building a vast, flat landscape. But this new land came with a problem. It was wet, very wet. Large parts were little more than marshes, swamps, mudflats, and shallow lakes. The sea flooded the region regularly. Storm surges pushed salt water deep inland. Entire areas disappeared beneath the tides. When Roman writers first arrived here, they could hardly believe what they saw. They described local inhabitants as people living on tiny islands of dirt surrounded by water. To them, it looked like one of the harshest places imaginable. But the people who lived here had already found a solution. If they couldn't stop the floods, they would rise above them. They began building artificial hills, known today as terps, basket by basket, shovel by shovel. Entire communities raised the ground beneath their homes. Some of these hills were built nearly 2,000 years ago. Amazingly, many still exist. Churches, farms, entire villages still stand on top of them today. These hills were the first chapter in a story that would last for centuries. The Dutch could not control the water yet, but they were already learning how to live with it. Then everything changed. Around 1,000 years ago, the Dutch stopped defending themselves from the sea and started attacking it. Instead of building isolated hills, they began surrounding entire areas with earthen walls. The first dikes were born. For the first time, communities could protect large sections of land. Fields could stay dry, villages could expand, agriculture could flourish. But dikes created a new challenge. A dike is only as strong as its weakest point. If one farmer neglected his section, everyone behind it could lose everything. A single failure could flood entire communities. The solution was revolutionary. People began organizing themselves into regional water boards. These organizations collected taxes, maintained dikes, enforced regulations, and ensured everyone contributed to the collective defense. Remarkably, these institutions still exist today. Many are older than the Dutch state itself. In fact, some historians consider them among the oldest democratic institutions in the world. Long before modern parliaments existed, local residents were voting on water management because survival depended on it. To this day, Dutch citizens still vote in water board elections. Alongside national elections, they literally elect the people responsible for controlling the water, and they take it seriously because in the Netherlands, water is not a political issue, it is an existential one. Over time, another tradition emerged. Whenever a flood threatened, local residents were required to help defend the dikes. Entire communities mobilized, working side by side to reinforce weak points, carrying sandbags, repairing breaches, protecting their homes. The tradition survives even today. During major storms, inspectors patrol the dikes looking for leaks and weaknesses, much like their ancestors did centuries ago. Many historians believe this constant battle against water helped shape the Dutch national character. Cooperation, pragmatism, compromise, collective responsibility. When you are facing a flood, arguments become meaningless. The dike either holds or it does not. The sea became an unlikely architect of Dutch society. But keeping water out was only half the challenge. Rain continued to fall, rivers continued to overflow, groundwater continued to rise, even protected land kept filling with water. Something else was needed, something capable of removing water continuously. And that is when the most famous symbol of the Netherlands entered the story, the windmill. Most people think windmills were built to grind grain, and many were. But in the Netherlands, thousands served a different purpose. They pumped water. Wind turned giant mechanisms connected to scoops, wheels, and screws. These systems lifted water from low areas and moved it into canals. From there, it flowed toward rivers and eventually the sea. This simple idea became one of the most important inventions in Dutch history, the polder. A polder is land reclaimed from water, protected by dikes, drained by canals, and kept dry by pumps. But there is one rule: the water must never stop moving, because the moment the pumps stop, the water starts coming back, and the sea remembers exactly where it used to be. The invention of the polder changed everything. For the first time in history, the Dutch were not simply defending themselves from water. They were taking land away from it. The process was deceptively simple. Build a dike around an area. Drain the water. Keep pumping forever. And suddenly, what had once been a lake became farmland. A marsh became a village. A piece of the sea became part of the country. Again and again, the Dutch repeated this process, year after year, century after century. The Netherlands slowly grew larger, not through conquest, not through war, but through engineering. Entire lakes disappeared from the map. One of the most famous examples was the Haarlemmermeer. For centuries, this enormous lake terrified nearby communities. Storms regularly expanded its shoreline, villages vanished beneath the waves, ships disappeared in its waters. Many believed the lake would eventually swallow the surrounding region. The Dutch had a different idea. They decided to erase it. Using an enormous network of pumps and drainage canals, engineers began removing billions of liters of water. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Eventually, the impossible happened. The lake was gone. In its place stood fertile farmland, roads, towns, and eventually one of Europe's busiest airports. Today, Schiphol Airport sits approximately 4 meters below sea level. Millions of passengers pass through it every year without realizing they are standing at the bottom of what was once a giant lake. The runways, the terminals, the control towers, all built on land that did not exist before. It is one of the most extraordinary examples of human-made geography anywhere on Earth, and it would not be the last. As the centuries passed, the Dutch became masters of land reclamation. Windmills spread across the landscape, thousands of them, working day and night, not grinding grain, but moving water. Each windmill lifted water a little higher. Sometimes one mill was not enough. The water needed to be raised in stages, so engineers built chains of windmills, one passing water to another, then another, until it finally reached a canal high enough to carry it away. The result looked almost magical. Lakes slowly shrinking, new fields appearing, entire communities emerging where fish had once swum. Perhaps nowhere is this legacy more visible than Kinderdijk. Today, 19 historic windmills still stand there, perfectly aligned along the canals, one of the most iconic landscapes in Europe. Millions of tourists visit every year. Most see a postcard. Few realize they are looking at one of the most important engineering systems in human history. Those windmills helped create the country itself. Without them, much of the Netherlands simply would not exist. But despite their beauty, windmills had limitations. They depended on weather. No wind meant no pumping. And as the country expanded, the challenge grew larger. The Dutch needed more power, more reliability, more control. Eventually, steam engines replaced many windmills, then diesel pumps, then electric systems. Today, the Netherlands operates thousands of pumping stations. Some are small and automatic. Others are enormous industrial machines capable of moving entire rivers. Together, they run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every year, without interruption. Because the Netherlands is not naturally dry, it is being kept dry at every moment by machines. Think about that for a second. Most countries use pumps occasionally. The Netherlands uses them permanently. The entire nation functions like a giant bathtub, and every day engineers must remove the water trying to fill it. The numbers are staggering. Millions upon millions of cubic meters of water are moved every single day. Rainwater, groundwater, river water, water that seeps through dikes, water that nature constantly tries to reclaim. The Dutch remove it all, again and again and again. But there was a hidden problem, one that nobody fully understood at first. The very act of draining the land was causing the country to sink. Much of the Netherlands sits on layers of peat. Peat is essentially ancient plant material compressed over thousands of years. When it is underwater, it remains stable, but when it is drained, something happens. It dries, it shrinks, and the ground begins to settle, slowly, relentlessly. The more water the Dutch removed, the lower the land became, which required more pumping, which caused more sinking, which required more dikes, which required more pumping. A vicious cycle, one that continues to this day. In some areas, the ground has subsided several meters over the centuries, meaning the country now depends even more heavily on its water management systems than before. It is a paradox. The Dutch became victims of their own success. Every victory against the water created new challenges, and every solution required even greater effort. There is no finish line, no final victory. Only continuous maintenance, continuous vigilance, continuous work. Perhaps that is why the Dutch developed an obsession with measuring water. Centuries ago, they established a reference point known as the Amsterdam Ordnance Datum, a standardized sea level benchmark. It became the foundation for measuring elevations across the country. Eventually, neighboring nations adopted it as well, and something remarkable happened. Today, when engineers in parts of Europe calculate altitude above sea level, they are often measuring it relative to Amsterdam. A small country built on swamps ended up defining the continent's vertical reference system. The Netherlands was not just changing its own geography, it was influencing how Europe understood geography itself. For centuries, the system worked. The dikes held, the pumps ran, the sea stayed outside. The Dutch continued reclaiming land, growing richer, building cities, expanding agriculture. It seemed they had finally mastered nature, but the sea was waiting, and in 1953, it reminded everyone who was really in charge. For centuries, the Dutch had held the line. The dikes stood, the pumps worked, the sea stayed outside. Generation after generation grew up believing the system would protect them, and for a long time it did. But nature has a way of reminding us who is really in control. On the night of February 1st, 1953, the sea struck back. It began with a storm, a powerful North Sea storm moving toward the Dutch coast. By itself, it would have been dangerous, but nature added something worse. a high spring tide. The two forces combined into a perfect disaster. Hurricane-force winds pushed enormous amounts of water toward the Netherlands. Hour after hour, the sea level climbed higher and higher and higher. The pressure on the dikes became immense. Many of them were old. Some had suffered years of neglect. Others had been weakened by the hardships of World War II. They were never designed to withstand what was coming. Then, in the darkness of the night, the first dike failed. Water exploded through the breach. Within minutes, entire sections of countryside began flooding. Then another dike failed, and another, and another. Soon dozens of breaches had opened across the southwest of the country. The sea was no longer outside, it was inside. People woke to the sound of water crashing through their homes. Families climbed onto tables, then onto beds, then into attics, desperately trying to stay above the rising flood. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Waves smashed against buildings. Roads disappeared beneath black water. Entire villages vanished into darkness. Some residents had only minutes to react. Others had no warning at all. Telephone lines were destroyed. Power failed. Communication collapsed. Many communities had no idea that neighboring towns were experiencing the same catastrophe. They believed they were facing the disaster alone. In reality, half the region was drowning. The sea showed no mercy. Houses collapsed under the force of the water. Livestock were swept away. Families became separated in the darkness. Children clung to rooftops. Parents searched desperately for loved ones. The cold made everything worse. The water was freezing. Survival became a race against time. At dawn, the scale of the disaster finally became visible. The images shocked the nation. Entire neighborhoods underwater, fields transformed into inland seas, church towers rising from floodwaters like lonely islands. The Netherlands had suffered many floods throughout its history, but nothing like this, not in modern times. Rescue operations began immediately, but reaching survivors was incredibly difficult. Roads were gone, bridges had disappeared, entire regions were isolated, and yet help came from everywhere. Fishermen launched their boats, military units mobilized, volunteers crossed flooded areas at enormous personal risk. Some used tiny vessels, others used whatever floated. Many rescues were improvised, and many rescuers became heroes. One of the most important rescue tools was not a machine. It was not a helicopter. It was not a military vehicle. It was radio. Amateur radio operators worked around the clock, broadcasting emergency messages, relaying requests for help, connecting isolated communities with the outside world. For days, they became the communication network of a nation in crisis. The final toll was devastating. More than 1.8 million people lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands were affected. Tens of thousands of animals perished. Entire communities were destroyed. For a small country, it was a national trauma, comparable to war, a disaster that would never be forgotten. But amid the tragedy emerged a story so extraordinary it sounds fictional. Yet every word is true. One breach in particular threatened the most densely populated region of the country. If the flood expanded further, millions of people could be at risk. Authorities desperately needed time. Time to reinforce defenses, time to organize a response, time they did not have. Then someone proposed an insane idea: use a ship. A local captain was asked to do something almost unimaginable. Steer his vessel directly into the breach, not around it, into it. The current was violent, the water roaring through the opening like a river. But the captain agreed. He pointed the bow toward the gap and drove straight into the rushing flood. The ship became wedged inside the breach, like a giant cork. The flow of water slowed dramatically. Engineers and volunteers rushed forward. Sandbags, earth, emergency repairs. They worked furiously. The ship had bought them precious time. time that may have saved millions of people from catastrophe. It remains one of the most remarkable acts in the history of Dutch flood defense. One captain, one ship, one impossible decision, and perhaps an entire region saved. When the floodwaters finally receded, the Netherlands faced a choice: rebuild the old system or create something entirely new. The government did not hesitate. Within weeks, a commission of engineers and experts was assembled. Their mission was simple: make sure this never happens again, no matter the cost. What they proposed would change the country forever. It would become one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. A project so vast that many believed it was impossible. A project that would eventually be called the Delta Works, and it would become humanity's greatest attempt to defeat the sea. The flood of 1953 changed the Netherlands forever. More than 1.8 million people had died, entire communities had been destroyed, and one terrifying truth had become impossible to ignore. The old defenses were no longer enough. The sea had found their weaknesses, and next time, the consequences could be even worse. The Dutch government reached a conclusion that would reshape the nation. If nature could not be trusted, then the country would build a system so advanced, so massive, and so reliable that another disaster like 1953 would become almost impossible. The project became known as the Delta Works, and to this day it remains one of the most ambitious engineering undertakings in human history. The goal was simple to describe and unbelievably difficult to achieve: protect the entire southwestern part of the country from the sea, not with one dike, not with one dam, but with an interconnected network of barriers, floodgates, dams, locks, and reinforced defenses stretching across hundreds of kilometers. The scale was staggering. Entire sections of coastline would be redesigned, estuaries would be reshaped, channels would be controlled, and the sea itself would be forced to obey human engineering. Construction began in the late 1950s and would continue for decades. Generation after generation of engineers worked on the project. Many would retire before seeing it completed. The Delta Works became more than infrastructure. It became a national mission, a promise to future generations. One of the first achievements was closing several vulnerable sea inlets. By shortening the coastline, engineers reduced the number of places where floodwaters could attack. It was a brilliant strategy. Protecting fewer kilometers meant building stronger defenses, but every solution created new questions, and one of those questions would lead to one of the most extraordinary structures ever built. The Oosterschelde Storm Surge Barrier, 9 kilometers long, made of gigantic concrete pillars weighing thousands of tons each, a structure so large that many engineers initially thought it could never be built. The original plan was straightforward. Close the entire estuary with a solid dam, seal it permanently, eliminate the flood risk forever. But something unexpected happened. People protested: fishermen, scientists, environmental groups, local communities. They all raised the same concern. Closing the estuary would destroy a unique ecosystem. The tides would disappear. The shellfish industry would collapse. The famous oysters and mussels of the region could vanish. Bird colonies would lose critical habitat. The sea would be stopped, but nature would pay the price. The debate divided the country. For years, politicians, engineers, and environmentalists argued. Then the Dutch did something remarkable. Instead of choosing between safety and nature, they chose both. The result was revolutionary: a movable storm surge barrier. Most of the time, the massive gates remain. Tides continue flowing naturally. Marine life survives. Fishing communities continue their traditions. The ecosystem remains alive. But when a major storm approaches, everything changes. The gates close, the sea is locked out, and millions of people remain protected. The barrier cost far more than a conventional dam. several times more. But the Dutch accepted the expense. Because protecting the country should not mean destroying the environment. Even today, many engineers consider the Oosterschelde Barrier one of the greatest examples of balancing infrastructure and ecology ever attempted. Yet astonishingly, it isn't even the most spectacular structure in the Delta works. That title belongs to something even more extraordinary, the misleading, the giant guardian of Rotterdam. Rotterdam is home to the largest port in Europe, one of the busiest ports on Earth. Every day, enormous cargo ships travel through its waterways. Closing the channel with a permanent dam was impossible. Global trade depended on it remaining. Engineers faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you stop the sea without stopping the ships? Their solution looked like science fiction. The misleading consists of two gigantic floating gates, each one among the largest moving structures ever built. The steel arms are so enormous that comparisons to the Eiffel Tower are common. Normally, the gates rest inside giant dry docks on either side of the waterway. Most people barely notice them. They sit quietly, waiting, watching. For years at a time, they may never move. But when danger approaches, the system awakens. Thousands of sensors continuously monitor weather conditions, sea levels, wind speeds, storm forecasts. Computer models predict future conditions hour by hour. If the water is expected to rise beyond a critical threshold, the decision is made automatically. No politicians, no debates, no last-minute hesitation. The computer decides, because human beings are capable of doubt. The sea is not. When the order is given, the giant gates begin moving, slowly, silently, almost like living creatures. The floating arms swing out into the channel, heading toward one another, until they meet in the middle. Then something extraordinary happens. The hollow structures fill with water. Thousands of tons of it. The gates sink, locking themselves onto the seabed, and suddenly, one of Europe's busiest waterways is sealed shut. Rotterdam is protected. The sea is held back. The entire operation is mesmerizing. Every autumn, the system is tested. Thousands of visitors gather to watch. Engineers monitor every movement. Tourists stand in awe, because witnessing the gates close feels less like watching infrastructure and more like watching a giant mechanical organism defending an entire nation. Remarkably, the barrier has only been deployed operationally a handful of times. The threshold is intentionally high. Closing it is expensive, disruptive, and economically significant. But when the sea threatens, cost becomes irrelevant. Protection comes first. Together, the Delta Works transformed Dutch flood defense. But perhaps their most impressive achievement is not concrete, or steel, or machinery. It is mathematics. Because the Dutch became the first nation on Earth to define flood protection in terms of probability, and the numbers they chose are astonishing. For the most densely populated parts of the country, defenses must withstand a flood event expected only once every 10,000 years. Think about that. 10,000 years. The last time humanity experienced such a time span, civilization itself did not exist. Writing had not yet been invented. Agriculture was still in its infancy. Yet Dutch engineers are expected to design defenses capable of surviving events with that level of rarity. Every dike is monitored, every barrier inspected, every weakness documented. Nothing is left to chance, because the Dutch learned something in 1953. The sea only needs to win once, and that is why, even today, they continue preparing for a battle that never truly ends. But in the decades that followed, the Dutch would do something even more astonishing. Something nobody expected. After spending 1,000 years taking land away from the water, they started giving it back. Long before the Delta Works were completed, the Dutch had already accomplished something many people considered impossible. They had changed the shape of their country, not metaphorically, literally. For centuries, a vast inland sea known as the Zuiderzee deep into the heart of the Netherlands. Storms entered through it, floods spread through it, entire regions lived under its constant threat. The Dutch looked at the problem and proposed a solution so ambitious it sounded absurd. They would close the sea. In the early 20th century, construction began on what would become one of the most remarkable engineering projects of its time, a giant dam, stretching 32 kilometers across the water, known today as the Afsluitdijk. When completed, it sealed the Zuiderzee off from the North Sea. Almost overnight, geography changed. Salt water gradually became fresh water. The dangerous inland sea transformed into a vast lake, the IJsselmeer. It was one of the greatest victories the Dutch had ever achieved against nature. But every victory comes with consequences. For centuries, entire communities had lived from the sea. Fishing villages depended on herring, eel, and maritime trade. Suddenly, their sea was gone. Many traditional ways of life disappeared almost overnight. Fishing fleets had to adapt. Communities had to reinvent themselves. One place tells this story better than anywhere else: Urk. For centuries, Urk had been an island, a small fishing community surrounded by water. Today it is surrounded by farmland. The island did not move, the sea disappeared. What was once isolated by water now sits in the middle of reclaimed land. Yet remarkably, the people of Urk never abandoned their identity. To this day, many still make their living from fishing, sailing through locks and channels to reach the North Sea, a reminder that even when geography changes, culture often survives. But the Dutch were not finished, not even close. Once the sea had been sealed off, they turned their attention to the newly created lake, and they asked a question that only the Dutch would ask. Could we drain that too? The answer was yes. And the result became one of the greatest land reclamation projects in human history. Using dikes, canals, and pumping stations, engineers began creating entirely new land from the bottom of the former sea. Over time, an entirely new province emerged, Flevoland, the largest artificial island on Earth. Hundreds of thousands of people now live there. Cities, roads, schools, farms, entire communities built where fish once swam. Perhaps the strangest part is what engineers discovered during construction. As the seabed emerged from the water, archaeologists began finding ships, not one or two, hundreds. Medieval fishing boats, merchant vessels, ancient cargo ships, entire fleets preserved beneath the mud. Some had been resting there for centuries. Others dated back to the Dutch Golden Age. Today, Flevoland is sometimes called the world's largest dry shipwreck graveyard. Farmers occasionally discover ancient timbers while plowing their fields. Imagine finding part of a 17th century ship beneath a wheat field. In most countries, that would seem impossible. In the Netherlands, it's normal. People are literally walking on the seabed, cycling across it, building homes on it, growing crops on it. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the famous Dutch tulip fields. Those endless, colorful landscapes that appear on postcards around the world. Many of them exist on land that was underwater only a century ago. What was once the floor of the sea has become one of the most photographed landscapes on Earth. But every story about the Netherlands eventually arrives at a famous legend. The story of the little boy who saved the country by putting his finger into a leaking dike. It's one of the most famous Dutch stories ever told. There's only one problem. It never happened. In fact, for generations, most Dutch people had never even heard the story. The tale didn't originate in the Netherlands at all. It came from an American children's novel published in the 19th century. The story became wildly popular internationally. Millions of children grew up believing it was authentic Dutch folklore. Tourists arrived asking where they could find the statue of the heroic boy. Eventually, the Dutch gave up correcting them and built statues anyway. A fictional story invented abroad had become part of Dutch tourism. But the real irony is that the legend makes no engineering sense whatsoever. A leaking dike cannot be stopped with a finger. Once water begins cutting through a weakness, the opening grows larger and larger. The pressure increases. The erosion accelerates. A real breach requires immediate repairs. Machines, materials, engineers, entire teams of people. The true heroes of Dutch flood defense were never fictional children. They were generations of workers, builders, inspectors, and engineers, people whose names history often forgot, yet whose work protects millions every day. There is another common misconception too. Many people believe Amsterdam is built on water like Venice. Not quite. Amsterdam is built on piles. Millions of them. Wooden piles in older sections, concrete piles in newer ones, driven deep through soft soil until they reach stable layers beneath. The Royal Palace alone stands on thousands of piles. Amsterdam's Central Station was built on artificial islands supported by enormous foundations. Without those hidden supports, much of the city would slowly sink. In a sense, the Netherlands isn't simply protected by engineering. It exists because of engineering. And yet, after 1,000 years of fighting the water, something changed. The Dutch began rethinking the entire relationship. For centuries, the strategy had been straightforward: build higher dikes, pump harder, take more land, keep the water out. But climate change forced a difficult question. What happens when the sea keeps rising? What happens when storms become stronger? What happens when rivers carry more water than ever before? Engineers reached a surprising conclusion. You can't keep building higher walls forever. Eventually, the risks become too great. A larger wall may stop more water, but if it fails, the consequences are catastrophic. So the Dutch developed a new philosophy. Instead of fighting water everywhere, make room for it. The program became known as Room for the River, and its logic was revolutionary. In some places, dikes were moved farther inland, floodplains were restored, land was intentionally given back. Farms were purchased, families relocated, painful decisions were made. But the reasoning was simple. It's better to sacrifice a field than lose an entire city. Some reclaimed areas were deliberately flooded, creating natural reservoirs capable of absorbing excess water during storms. The Dutch had spent centuries forcing nature into narrow channels. Now they were learning to work with it instead. The transformation didn't stop there. In Rotterdam, engineers began designing public spaces that double as flood infrastructure, parks that become temporary lakes during heavy rain, plazas that store stormwater instead of flooding neighborhoods. Even housing is evolving. Floating neighborhoods have already appeared. Entire communities built on water. Homes connected to utilities just like traditional houses, but capable of rising and falling with changing water levels. If the water rises, the house rises too. No panic, no evacuation, no disaster, just adaptation. Some architects believe floating cities could become a model for coastal regions around the world. The Netherlands is no longer simply defending itself against the future, it is experimenting with it. Perhaps the most elegant example of this new philosophy is something called the sand motor. Instead of constantly rebuilding eroding beaches, engineers created a gigantic artificial peninsula made of millions of cubic meters of sand. Then they let nature do the rest. Currents, waves, and tides gradually distribute the sand along the coastline, strengthening beaches naturally for years. No continuous construction required. The sea itself becomes part of the solution. After 1,000 years of conflict, the Dutch are finally learning how to cooperate with water. And perhaps that is their greatest achievement of all. Today, countries around the world study Dutch expertise, from New Orleans to New York, from Bangladesh to Vietnam, from Jakarta to Venice. When coastal cities think about rising seas, they often call the Netherlands first. because no nation has spent more time solving this problem. The Dutch understand something few others do. The battle against water is never truly won. It is managed, maintained, adapted, year after year, generation after generation. And what would happen if all the pumps stopped? Engineers have asked that question too. The answer is sobering. Low-lying areas would begin flooding within days. Over time, lakes would reappear, fields would disappear. The landscape would slowly revert to what it once was. In a sense, the Netherlands is like a bicycle. It exists because people keep pedaling. The moment they stop, things begin moving backward. But after 1,000 years, there is no sign of stopping, because this story is about more than water. It is about persistence, ingenuity, cooperation, and the extraordinary things human beings can accomplish when survival depends on it. The Netherlands should be underwater. By every law of nature, it should not exist. And yet, against all odds, it does.